I received a leaked Pentagon procurement document at 11 p.m. last night that I've read 6 times and still can't fully believe. The header was marked confidential, distribution restricted, and the subject line made my hands go numb. Emergency directive, cessation of COMEX, silver contract reliance for defense manufacturing. Buried in paragraph 7 was a single sentence that represents the most significant shift in commodity markets in 50 years. Effective immediately, all Department of Defense contractors are instructed to source physical silver exclusively through direct mining agreements and verified physical delivery channels, bypassing COMEX futures and derivative contracts entirely. The Pentagon just walked away from COMEX. And 12 hours before I got this document, Samsung announced they're doing the exact same thing. The silver blackout isn't coming. It's here. And what I've uncovered in the last 14 hours will shake you to your core. Let me take you back 72 hours because the Samsung announcement didn't come out of nowhere, even though it blindsided markets and sent shockwaves through the financial world. On Monday morning, Samsung's head of strategic procurement, a man named Kim Ji-hoon, who's been with the company for 23 years, held a press conference in Seoul that was scheduled with only 4 hours' notice. The room was packed with Korean financial journalists, and I watched the live stream from my apartment at 3 a.m. because something told me this was going to be important. Kim stood at the podium looking like he hadn't slept in days, and his opening statement was delivered with the kind of intensity that comes from someone who's been fighting internal battles and finally got permission to tell the truth. Samsung Electronics will no longer accept COMEX silver certificates or futures contracts as valid supply guarantees for our manufacturing operations, he said in English, his accent thick but his words crystal clear. We require physical silver, verified and delivered to our facilities, from sources we can independently confirm. The paper market has become unreliable, and we cannot risk our production schedules on promises that may not be fulfilled. The implications of that statement hit the markets like a bomb with a delayed fuse. Within 2 hours, COMEX silver futures dropped 7% as traders realized what Samsung's announcement actually meant. But here's what most people missed, what I only understood after talking to 3 different sources in the electronics manufacturing industry. Samsung uses approximately 11 million ounces of silver annually for their smartphone production, television manufacturing, semiconductor fabrication, and solar panel operations. 11 million ounces. That's not a small amount. That's roughly 1.3% of total global annual silver mine production. When a consumer of that size publicly declares they no longer trust the paper silver market and will only accept physical delivery from verified sources, they're essentially telling the world that COMEX contracts are worthless. And if Samsung believes that, who else is about to reach the same conclusion? I called my contact at the Defense Logistics Agency, a civilian analyst named Robert Chen, who I've known since we were both junior researchers at a think tank in Washington 15 years ago, and when he finally called me back 3 hours after my initial message, he was calling from a secure line and speaking in the careful way people do when they know they're being recorded. I can't confirm the document you're referring to, he said slowly, choosing every word with precision. But I can tell you that there have been significant concerns at senior levels about supply chain reliability for strategic materials, including silver, and those concerns have escalated substantially in recent months. That was Robert's way of confirming everything without actually confirming anything. The Pentagon procurement document I received detailed a shift in policy that's been developing since August, when the Defense Department conducted an audit of critical materials and discovered something that apparently caused genuine panic. The military's silver supply chain was almost entirely dependent on COMEX futures contracts and paper certificates, and when auditors actually tried to verify physical silver availability for defense contractor needs, they found massive discrepancies between paper claims and actual physical metal. The graph I'm looking at right now, data compiled from COMEX warehouse reports over the last 18 months, shows a story that should terrify anyone paying attention. In June of last year, COMEX registered silver inventory, that's the silver available for immediate delivery against futures contracts, stood at 87 million ounces. By December, it had dropped to 63 million. By this March, 41 million. And as of last week, before Samsung and the Pentagon made their moves, COMEX registered inventory was at 29 million ounces. That's a 66% decline in 18 months. Now think about what happens when major industrial consumers like Samsung, which needs 11 million ounces annually, and the Department of Defense, which uses an estimated 8 to 12 million ounces annually for defense applications, including electronics, communication systems, missile guidance, and solar arrays for military installations, suddenly demand physical delivery instead of accepting paper promises. The math is simple and brutal. COMEX doesn't have enough physical silver to satisfy even 2 or 3 major industrial users if they all demand delivery simultaneously. I spoke with Dr. Laura Martinez, a supply chain economist who consults for several Fortune 500 manufacturers, and her analysis was delivered with an urgency I'd never heard from her before. What Samsung did is going to trigger a cascade, she told me over a video call where I could see the stress in her eyes. I've already had 3 client calls this morning from companies asking whether they should follow Samsung's lead and demand physical silver delivery for their manufacturing needs. These are companies that use anywhere from 500,000 to 3 million ounces annually. If even half of them switch from paper contracts to physical delivery demands, COMEX will face a delivery crisis within 60 days. There simply isn't enough registered inventory to satisfy physical delivery at current demand levels, and mine production can't scale up fast enough to fill the gap. She pulled up a chart showing global silver mine production versus industrial demand, and the gap between the two lines has been widening for 7 consecutive years. We've been filling that gap with above-ground stockpiles and COMEX inventory. But stockpiles are finite, COMEX inventory is nearly depleted, and now the largest industrial consumers are demanding physical metal instead of paper promises. What keeps me up at night, what has my mind racing too fast to sleep, is understanding why Samsung and the Pentagon reached this conclusion at almost the exact same time. These are separate organizations with different priorities and information sources, yet they both independently decided within days of each other that COMEX can't be trusted. That suggests they're both seeing the same data, the same warning signs, the same evidence of systemic problems in the paper-silver market. I obtained a copy of an internal Samsung risk assessment report from a source in their Seoul headquarters, and the document is absolutely damning in its conclusions. Samsung's procurement team conducted physical delivery tests over a 6-month period, attempting to take actual delivery of silver against futures contracts they held. Out of 17 delivery attempts totaling 2.3 million ounces, they successfully received physical silver only 9 times. 8 times, roughly 47%, they received notices of delay, force majeure declarations, or offers of cash settlement instead of metal. 47% failure rate. For a manufacturing operation where production schedules are planned months in advance and delays cost millions of dollars per day, that failure rate is absolutely unacceptable. The Pentagon's concerns run even deeper and touch on national security implications that should worry every American. I interviewed Colonel James Mitchell, retired, who spent 12 years in defense acquisition before leaving the military in frustration over procurement failures. He explained that silver is critical for dozens of defense applications that most civilians never think about. Every Tomahawk missile uses silver in its guidance systems, he told me, his voice carrying the weight of someone who's seen what happens when supply chains fail. Aegis combat systems, F-35 electronics, satellite communications, encrypted radio systems, night vision equipment, virtually every advanced military technology requires silver for its conductivity and reliability properties. If we can't secure physical silver supply for defense contractors, we're talking about production delays for weapon systems that protect this country. That's not a market problem. That's a national security crisis. He explained that the Pentagon's shift away from COMEX isn't a preference or a strategy tweak. It's an emergency response to a supply chain vulnerability that senior Defense Department officials believe could be exploited by adversaries. The immediate market reaction to these developments has been chaotic and revealing. COMEX silver futures are trading in a bizarre pattern where spot prices are disconnected from physical prices by margins I've never seen before. This morning, COMEX spot silver was quoted at $34.18 per ounce. But when I called 3 different physical silver dealers to actually buy metal, not contracts, but actual coins or bars, the lowest price I was quoted was $47 per ounce with a 3-week delivery delay. That's a $13 premium, nearly 40% over spot price. One dealer in Texas told me he's never seen premiums this high in his 31 years in business. People are calling asking for silver, and I literally don't have it to sell them, he said, frustration evident in his voice. I can get you paper contracts all day long at spot price. But if you want metal you can hold, metal that actually exists, you're going to pay a massive premium and wait weeks or months for delivery. That spread between paper and physical is the market screaming that something is fundamentally broken. I obtained trading data from a commodities broker showing order flow in silver futures over the last 72 hours, and the pattern is absolutely wild. Massive sell orders in paper silver futures are driving COMEX prices down, while, simultaneously, physical silver premiums are exploding higher as buyers desperately try to source actual metal. Someone with deep pockets is selling paper silver to suppress futures prices, while the real-world price for physical metal goes parabolic. This is exactly the kind of manipulation that happens when paper markets become disconnected from physical reality, when the promises vastly exceed the actual underlying commodity. And now that Samsung and the Pentagon have publicly declared they won't accept those paper promises anymore, the entire facade is beginning to crumble. I spoke with Michael Torres, who runs a mid-sized electronics manufacturer in California that produces components for both consumer products and defense contractors. And his perspective gave me a ground-level view of how this blackout is affecting real businesses right now. We got a notice from our primary silver supplier yesterday saying they can't guarantee delivery timelines anymore, he told me. the stress audible in every word. We have contracts to fulfill, we have production schedules, we employ 340 people who depend on us keeping this operation running. And now we're being told that the silver we need, silver we've purchased futures contracts for months ago, might not actually be available when we need it. How are we supposed to plan? How are we supposed to operate? He explained that he's now scrambling to find alternative suppliers, trying to secure physical silver through direct mining contacts, paying premiums he never budgeted for, and considering whether he needs to stockpile months of silver inventory just to ensure business continuity. His company isn't alone. This is happening across the entire manufacturing sector that depends on silver. The geopolitical dimension of this crisis is escalating faster than most people realize. China announced this morning that they're implementing export restrictions on refined silver, citing domestic industrial needs and national security considerations. That's diplomatic language for we're keeping our silver for ourselves because we see what's coming. Mexico, the world's largest silver producer, has seen its government quietly approach mining companies about increasing domestic refining capacity rather than exporting raw ore. Peru is considering similar measures. When major producing nations start thinking about restricting exports of a strategic material, that's not a normal market dynamic. That's the early stage of a resource war where nations prioritize domestic supply over international trade. And it's happening because countries are watching Samsung and the Pentagon walk away from COMEX, and they're drawing the obvious conclusion. Physical silver is becoming more valuable than the paper markets suggest, and whoever controls physical supply will have enormous leverage. What terrifies me about this situation, what makes my stomach clench every time I look at the data, is how quickly it's accelerating and how few people understand what's happening. 72 hours ago, COMEX was still the trusted benchmark for silver pricing and trading. Today, the two largest industrial consumers have publicly declared it unreliable. How long before other major manufacturers follow? How long before investment funds start demanding physical delivery instead of holding paper ETFs? How long before the general public realizes that their silver investments might be backed by promises rather than actual metal? The cascade Laura Martinez predicted isn't a future possibility. It's already starting. I'm seeing reports of increased delivery demands, rising failure rates, expanding premiums, and growing panic among anyone who actually understands the supply fundamentals. The graph that haunts me shows COMEX registered inventory declining at an accelerating rate over the last 18 months. And if you project that trend forward even conservatively, registered inventory hits zero somewhere between late August and early October of this year. Zero. Now that projection assumes current demand patterns. But Samsung and the Pentagon walking away doesn't decrease demand for physical silver. It increases it dramatically because now everyone else who depends on silver is asking themselves whether they should be demanding physical delivery too. If that happens, if we see a broad shift from paper to physical among industrial users, COMEX registered inventory could hit zero within weeks, not months. And when that happens, when the exchange literally runs out of physical metal to deliver against contracts, the entire paper, silver market collapses. Futures contracts become worthless. ETFs that claim to be backed by silver are exposed as fractional at best. And the price of physical silver, actual metal you can hold, could gap up to levels that seem impossible today but will seem inevitable in hindsight. I reached out to the COMEX press office for comment on Samsung and Pentagon concerns about physical delivery reliability, and after 2 days of "we'll get back to you" responses, I finally received a statement that was so carefully worded, it actually confirmed all my worst fears. COMEX maintains robust physical silver inventory adequate to meet current market demands and operates in full compliance with all regulatory requirements. Our futures contracts represent legitimate financial instruments with well-established settlement procedures. Notice what that statement doesn't say. It doesn't say they can satisfy all delivery demands if major industrial users switch from paper to physical. It doesn't address declining registered inventory. It doesn't explain the massive premium gaps between futures and physical. It's the kind of carefully parsed corporate speak that lawyers write when they're trying to avoid saying anything actionable, while also avoiding obvious lies. It's the same kind of language banks used in 2007 when they said their mortgage-backed securities were sound and well collateralized. Here's what I'm doing personally, and I want to be clear, this is not financial advice, just one person's response to what they're seeing in the data. I'm treating any silver investment I hold as potentially having a delivery problem if it's paper-based. I'm reviewing every ETF, every futures contract, every certificate claiming to represent silver ownership, and I'm asking the hard question. If I demanded physical delivery tomorrow, would I actually get metal, or would I get excuses? I'm reducing exposure to paper silver and increasing holdings of physical coins and bars that I can verify and hold. I'm preparing for scenarios where the COMEX silver market experiences a delivery crisis that spreads to other precious metals and potentially other commodity markets. I'm watching for the cascade that follows Samsung and the Pentagon, because I genuinely believe other major industrial consumers are going to follow their lead within days or weeks. And I'm sharing this information because I believe most Americans have no idea how serious the situation is becoming. The conclusion I've reached after hundreds of hours researching this, after dozens of conversations with insiders across manufacturing, defense, mining, and financial sectors, after analyzing data until my eyes blur, is simple and terrifying. The paper-silver market is breaking down in real time, and the institutions that created and profited from that market are desperately trying to maintain the illusion that everything is fine while they quietly exit their positions and secure physical metal for themselves. Samsung and the Pentagon aren't making these moves because they're worried. They're making these moves because they have information suggesting the system is on the verge of collapse, and they're protecting their critical interests before the general public figures out what's happening. The silver blackout is the moment when paper promises are exposed as empty and physical reality reasserts itself with brutal force. We're watching the early stages of a crisis that will reshape commodity markets, industrial supply chains, and investment portfolios across the entire global economy. The ending I want you to take from this isn't panic, though the information certainly justifies concern. The ending I want you to take is awareness and preparation. Understand that major institutional players are walking away from COMEX because they no longer trust it to deliver physical silver when needed. Understand that the gap between paper prices and physical prices is widening to unprecedented levels. Understand that supply chain fragility in strategic materials has national security implications that go far beyond investment portfolios. Understand that what happened to Samsung, 47% delivery failure rate, could happen to anyone holding paper-silver contracts or ETFs if the system faces the kind of stress that Samsung and the Pentagon are clearly anticipating. The blackout begins when enough participants demand physical delivery that COMEX can't fulfill. That moment might be weeks away, or it might have already started. Either way, the time to understand what's happening and take appropriate action is now, before the cascade accelerates, before prices gap beyond reach, before the system breaks completely and leaves millions of investors and industrial consumers scrambling for physical metal that simply doesn't exist in the quantities the paper market promised. Samsung walked away. The Pentagon walked away. Ask yourself why, and ask yourself whether you should be walking away too, before there's nowhere left to walk except into a market that has collapsed under the weight of its own fraudulent leverage. Consider yourself warned. Consider yourself informed. And whatever you do, don't assume the institutions managing these markets have your interests at heart. They're protecting themselves. You need to protect yourself. The blackout has begun. The only question is whether you'll see it coming, or whether you'll be one of the millions who realize too late that the promises they trusted were never backed by reality.